You know, every society, big or small, runs on a set of rules. It's like an invisible architecture that keeps everything from just falling apart. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain and explore that very architecture, the blueprint for our world, the legal system. All right, so here's the game plan. We're going to start with the absolute foundation, then explore all the different sections. We'll meet the referees who enforce the rules, see where the building blocks actually come from, learn how to read the plans, and finally, we'll look at the moral compass that guides the entire project.
Okay, first things first, let's talk about the foundation. I mean, any great structure needs a solid base. And for society, that base is the very concept of law itself.
So, what is law, really? Well, it's way more than just a list of suggestions. It's a systematic, and this is the really crucial part, a binding set of rules. And that word, binding, is key. It means these rules come from a governing authority that has the actual power to enforce them, all in the name of keeping things orderly and just. Now, a blueprint isn't just this one giant sheet of paper, right? It's divided into specialized sections for plumbing, electrical, all that stuff. Well, law is pretty much the same. Let's look at its core divisions. So, the legal world is basically broken down into these handy pairs that define what's what. First, you've got public law, which is all about your relationship with the state. We're talking constitutional law or criminal law. Then there's private law, which covers disputes between you and me, like contracts or who owns what property. And then you have this really cool distinction, substantive versus procedural law. Think of it like a game. Substantive law tells you your rights and duties, like the right to a fair trial. Procedural law, on the other hand, is the rulebook for how you actually play the game.
Okay, so around the world, you'll find that legal systems pretty much run on one of two main operating systems. In common law countries, like the US and the UK, the law literally evolves over time, built on the decisions that judges have made in past cases. But in civil law systems, which you see all over Europe, they rely on these really comprehensive legal codes that were written down in advance. It's two very different paths to get to the same destination: justice.
So we've got the rules, but who interprets them? Who calls the fouls when things get tricky? Well, that brings us to the main framework of our blueprint, the courts.
You can think of it as the ladder of justice. Everything kicks off in the trial courts. That's where the facts of a case get laid out and a decision is made. Now, if someone thinks a legal mistake was made, they can climb that ladder to an appellate court, which doesn't rehear the facts but reviews how the law was applied. And way up at the top, you have the Supreme Court. They're the final say, and their rulings set what's called a binding precedent, which means every lower court has to follow that decision from then on. And get this, the judge's role can be totally different depending on where you are. In an adversarial system, the judge is basically a neutral referee, making sure two opposing legal teams play by the rules. But in an inquisitorial system, the judge becomes more like a lead detective, actively digging into the facts of the case to try and find the truth.
Okay, we've got the framework down, but what about the actual bricks and mortar? I mean, where do these rules we call laws actually come from?
Yeah, it seems like a simple question, right? But the answer is pretty fascinating. Who really holds the pen when it comes to writing the laws that govern all of us?
Well, there are two primary sources. First, there's legislation. These are the big formal laws, or statutes, that are passed by elected officials in a legislature. And then there's case law, which we touched on a little earlier. This is the law that kind of grows organically, piece by piece, from the decisions that judges make inside the courtroom. But here's the thing, a legislature can't possibly write every single tiny rule for our super complex world. It's just not practical. So they create something called delegated legislation. This is where they pass a broad primary law, the main part of the blueprint, and then they delegate the authority to an expert body to fill in all the nitty-gritty details. So for example, a legislature might pass a law for airline safety, but they'll let an agency full of aviation experts create the super specific maintenance schedules.
So you can probably see this whole approach is a classic trade-off, right? On the one hand, the advantages are huge. It's efficient, it's flexible, and it puts really complex rulemaking into the hands of experts who know their stuff. But the downside, it can create what's called a democratic deficit, because these really detailed binding rules are being made by unelected officials with a lot less public scrutiny. It's a constant balancing act.
All right, so you've got the blueprint in hand. But let's be honest, those things can be super confusing to read. So how do judges figure out what a law is actually trying to say? Well, they need a user manual.
You see, interpreting the law isn't just some random guesswork. It's a real craft, and it requires a very specific set of tools.
Judges turn to this established toolkit of rules and aids to figure out what the legislature was really trying to do, which helps make sure the law is applied consistently and fairly.
And here are the 4 main tools in that kit. A judge might start with the literal rule. What do the words plainly mean? But if that leads to some totally ridiculous outcome, they can use the golden rule to tweak the meaning a bit. The mischief rule asks, hey, what problem was this law actually trying to fix? And the purposive approach takes a big step back and looks at the law's overall goal.
And on top of those rules, judges also look for clues. Intrinsic aids are things found right there inside the law itself, like a definitions section. Extrinsic aids are clues from the outside, like reading the original parliamentary debates to see what the lawmakers were thinking. It's kind of like finding the architect's original notes scribbled on the blueprint.
All right, last but definitely not least. Every blueprint, every structure, it should serve a higher purpose. For the law, that purpose is guided by an absolutely essential moral compass: human rights.
This statement really gets to the very heart of it. Universal means they apply to everyone, everywhere, no exceptions. Inalienable means they can't be taken away from you. And interdependent means they're all connected. This isn't just some nice idea, it's a foundational principle of modern justice.
And this isn't just feel-good stuff. Human rights have real teeth. They act as a critical check on state power, making sure governments are held accountable. They provide the moral bedrock that shapes our national laws and constitutions. And most importantly, they empower every single one of us to stand up and advocate for our own fundamental dignity and rights. And that leaves us with one final, really big thought. We've seen how the blueprint works, who gets to interpret it, and the moral principles that guide it. But that leaves us with a huge question. If law is the design for our entire society, who gets to be the architect? It's definitely something to think about.